Sullivan Street in Greenwich Village is a quiet block, and Snyder Avenue in South Philadelphia is the same kind of street, the kind that in any other city would be entirely unremarkable, a row of modest houses where a neighborhood looked in 1980 much as it had looked 30 years before. And it was on Snyder Avenue outside the row house at 934 on the evening of March 21st, 1980, that one of the last of the old school mob bosses sat in the passenger seat of his car and took a shotgun blast to the back of his head, killed by a conspiracy organized by the man whose job was to counsel him. The man who died that night was Angelo Bruno. He had ruled the Philadelphia crime family for 21 years by refusing to do what everyone around him said would make him rich. He said no to drug trafficking when the heroin trade was generating fortunes. He said no to aggressive expansion into Atlantic City when the casinos opened and the money poured in. He kept his violence minimal, his profile low, his ambitions modest. The man who counseled him, whose title was consigliere and whose role was advisor, decided the old man's caution had become an obstacle. Within a month of Bruno's death, the consigliere was dead, tortured, and killed on orders from the Commission, the ruling body of organized crime families that Bruno had served and the consigliere had ignored. Within a year, the boss who replaced Bruno was dead, killed by a nail bomb planted under his porch. Within a decade, the family that had operated in relative peace for 2 decades had torn itself apart in a war that brought exactly what Bruno had spent 21 years avoiding: cooperating witnesses, federal indictments, and RICO convictions that dismantled the organization. Some accounts report that $300 was found stuffed in Angelo Bruno's mouth when his body was discovered, a symbolic payment for the profits he had refused to pursue, though this detail cannot be definitively verified from primary law enforcement sources and may be folklore that attached itself to the story afterward. What can be verified is everything that happened next, and what happened next proved that the dead man had been right, and everyone who thought they could do better had been catastrophically wrong. Drop where you are watching from in the comments below. It is genuinely one of the best parts of doing this. If you are new here and want more history like this delivered straight to you, subscribe now. Back to Snyder Avenue and the man who kept the peace by refusing every opportunity to break it. Angelo Bruno had been boss of the Philadelphia crime family for 21 years when someone put a shotgun to the back of his head and pulled the trigger, and those 21 years represented a kind of stability that organized crime in America almost never produced and would not produce again. He was known as the Gentle Don and the Docile Don, nicknames that suggested weakness to anyone who did not understand what they actually meant. Bruno was not gentle in the sense of being soft or ineffective. He was gentle in the sense that he understood violence was a tool that became less useful the more frequently you deployed it, and that the bosses who lasted were not the ones who killed the most people, but the ones who killed only when the institutional logic of their position required it, and never when personal ego or short-term opportunity tempted them. He ruled from the same modest row house at 934 Snyder Avenue in South Philadelphia, where he had lived for decades, a neighborhood where everyone knew who he was and what he represented, and where his presence was simply part of the landscape. He controlled gambling operations, loan sharking, and labor racketeering across Philadelphia and South Jersey. He maintained working relationships with the construction industry, the longshoremen's unions, and the network of legitimate businesses that served as fronts for the money his organization generated. He commanded an estimated 50 to 60 made members and several hundred associates, a family that was smaller than New York's 5 families, but significant enough to require commission-level coordination and respect. His organization generated millions of dollars annually, though exact figures were never documented because Bruno ran his operation with the kind of discipline that kept financial records out of government hands and conversations out of rooms where listening devices might be planted. What made Bruno remarkable was not what he controlled, but what he refused to control. He said no to large-scale drug trafficking when heroin profits were enormous and other families were building empires on narcotics. He said no to aggressive expansion into Atlantic City when the casinos opened in 1978 and everyone around him could see the money cascading through Resorts International and the other gambling palaces rising along the boardwalk. He kept violence to a minimum, avoided newspaper headlines, and maintained peaceful relationships with the other families, particularly New York's Genovese family, with whom he had cultivated decades of mutual respect and operational coordination. 21 years as boss without being killed or imprisoned was a remarkable record in a world where most men in his position lasted 5 years if they were lucky and competent, 10 if they were exceptional. Bruno's longevity was not luck. It was the result of a philosophy that prioritized institutional survival over individual enrichment, long-term stability over maximum short-term profit, and organizational discipline over personal ambition. This approach kept him alive and free for 2 decades. It also frustrated the men around him who watched opportunities pass by and calculated that the old man's caution was costing everyone a fortune. The man who counseled him had been watching those opportunities pass by for years, and by 1980 he had decided the old man's caution was costing everyone too much. Angelo Annaloro was born on May 21st, 1910, in Villalba, Sicily, a town in the interior of the island where the traditions that governed his entire adult life had been practiced for generations before Mussolini tried to break them and failed. He emigrated to the United States as a child with his family and grew up in South Philadelphia's Italian-American neighborhoods, the streets where the same families lived for decades, and where everyone understood that certain men controlled certain activities and that this arrangement was as much a part of the social structure as the church or the corner store. He changed his surname from Annaloro to Bruno at some point during his youth, a common practice among Italian immigrants and their children who wanted names that sounded less foreign or who wanted to distance themselves from family histories that might complicate their American lives. He rose through the Philadelphia crime family during the 1930s and 40s, learning the business during an era when discretion was rewarded and visibility was punished, when the bosses who lasted were the ones who understood that law enforcement could be managed, but never eliminated, and that the key to longevity was giving prosecutors as little as possible to work with. Philadelphia's organized crime family was smaller than the New York operations, but held significant regional power, controlling labor unions in the construction trades and on the waterfront, running gambling and loan sharking operations that generated steady income, and maintaining the kind of political and law enforcement relationships that allowed the business to function without constant interference. Bruno learned from bosses who valued patience over aggression, relationships over confrontation, and the long view over the immediate score. He married Sue Maranka and had 2 children. He maintained legitimate business fronts, including vending machine operations and real estate holdings, the kind of businesses that generated plausible income and allowed a man to explain where his money came from if anyone asked. He lived modestly throughout his career, never moving from South Philadelphia, never buying the kind of mansion or luxury car that would draw attention, never displaying wealth in ways that would make him a target for law enforcement, or subject of resentment within his own organization. When he became boss in 1959, the transition was peaceful, which suggested he had the respect of the men he would command and the approval of the commission members whose authorization was required for anyone to claim that title. His approach from the beginning was consistent with everything he had learned over the previous 30 years. Avoid unnecessary violence, maintain a low profile, build relationships with the other families, and understand that the criminal organization that survived was not the one that grabbed everything it could see, but the one that knew what to leave alone. The world he entered was governed by rules, rules enforced by the commission, rules about respect for hierarchy and proper authorization for major decisions and punishment for men who violated the structure. Bruno understood these rules because he had watched men who ignored them get killed, and he never violated them. By the time he took the title, he had spent 30 years learning that the bosses who lasted were not the ones who grabbed everything they could see, but the ones who knew what to leave alone. Antonio Caponigro had a different set of calculations running, and by the late 1970s, those calculations had led him to a conclusion that would get him killed. Caponigro's full name was Antonio Caponigro, and his nickname was Tony Bananas, and his role in the Philadelphia family was consigliere, the third position in the hierarchy after boss and underboss, the counselor whose job was to advise the boss on strategy and mediate internal disputes and serve as the institutional voice of reason when decisions needed to be made. Caponigro was based in Newark, New Jersey, where he controlled family operations in North Jersey under Bruno's authority, running gambling and loan sharking and maintaining the relationships with labor unions and legitimate businesses that allowed the money to flow. He was approximately 67 years old in 1980, a career criminal with decades of experience, not a young hothead acting on impulse, but a man who had been in the life long enough to understand how it worked and who had decided that the way it worked was changing in ways that Bruno either did not see or refused to acknowledge. The consigliere position gave him institutional standing and access to the boss, which meant he had a clear view of the opportunities Bruno was refusing and the reasoning Bruno used to justify those refusals. Atlantic City casinos had opened in 1978 when New Jersey legalized gambling, and Resorts International became the first legal casino on the boardwalk in May of that year. Within months, other casinos followed, and within a few years, Atlantic City was generating hundreds of millions of dollars annually, money that flowed through gambling tables and hotel rooms and restaurants and construction contracts and the labor unions that controlled who worked and at what price. The traditional mob rackets were all there for the taking, skimming from casino revenues, loan sharking to gamblers who lost more than they could afford, union control that allowed families to extract payments from every major construction project, and the political relationships that determined which businesses operated and which did not. Bruno's position on Atlantic City was cautious. He maintained some involvement but refused the aggressive expansion that Caponigro and others believed the situation demanded. Drug trafficking was similarly lucrative, with heroin generating enormous profits for families willing to take the risks, and Bruno's position on that was even more conservative. The money was real, but the law enforcement attention that came with narcotics trafficking was more dangerous than any potential profit justified. Caponigro's position was that the money was too large to ignore, that the opportunities were there and someone would take them, and that if the Philadelphia family did not move aggressively, other families would, and the Philadelphia family would be left with smaller territories and smaller profits while everyone else got rich. The tension between these two calculations, between old school caution and new school ambition, had been building through the late 1970s as casino revenue climbed and drug money flowed, and Caponigro watched Bruno say no over and over again. Caponigro was not young or reckless, he was in his 60s, but he represented a different philosophy, a calculation that the rules had changed, that the Commission's authority had weakened, that the old ways of doing business no longer applied in an era when the money was too big and the opportunities too obvious for caution to make sense. This calculation was completely wrong, but Caponigro would not learn that until it was too late. By late 1979, Caponigro had made a decision that would require him to do two things: kill his boss and convince himself that the Commission would accept it after the fact. The Commission was the ruling body of La Cosa Nostra, composed of the bosses of New York's 5 families, and selected other family leaders, including Angelo Bruno, and the primary rule it enforced was simple: you did not kill a boss without permission. The Commission existed to prevent interfamily wars, to authorize the removal of bosses when circumstances required it, and to settle disputes that individual families could not resolve internally. Violations of Commission authority had historically brought swift and brutal punishment because the alternative to centralized authority was chaos, and chaos was bad for business. The central rule, the rule that mattered more than any other, was that no boss could be killed without Commission approval, because allowing unauthorized hits on bosses would mean that anyone ambitious enough and violent enough could destabilize an entire family and trigger wars that damaged everyone's earning capacity. Caponigro's apparent belief, based on sources that remain disputed, was that he could obtain approval after the fact, or that the Commission's authority had weakened to the point where approval no longer mattered, or that he had engaged in preliminary discussions with members of New York's Genovese family that he interpreted as tacit permission to proceed. Some sources suggest he genuinely believed he had signals of support from commission members. Other sources suggest he acted entirely on his own calculation, that times had changed and the old rules no longer applied. What is certain is that he miscalculated completely, that the commission's authority had not weakened, and that his decision to kill Bruno without authorization would result in his own death within weeks. The co-conspirators in the plot were John Simone, who was Caponigro's brother-in-law, and Frank Sindoni, both career criminals with their own operations under the family structure. The planning occurred in late 1979 and early 1980. The method was straightforward. A shotgun, close range, Bruno in his car outside his home, a shot to the back of the head that would kill him instantly. The identity of the person who actually pulled the trigger remains officially uncertain in available sources. Caponigro organized the hit, but whether he fired the weapon himself or assigned the task to someone else is not definitively documented. What the decision demonstrated was either extraordinary arrogance or a complete misunderstanding of institutional reality. Bruno was not just any boss. He had close relationships with commission members, particularly in the Genovese family. He had served peacefully and profitably for 21 years. His removal without authorization would be seen not just as a violation of procedure, but as an insult to the commission's authority and a threat to the entire system that depended on that authority being respected. If one consigliere could kill one boss without permission and get away with it, then every ambitious underboss and captain in every family would understand that the rules no longer protected anyone, and the result would be wars that destroyed the stability everyone depended on. Caponigro had bet that the commission either would not care or could not respond effectively. He was catastrophically wrong on both counts. On the evening of March 21st, 1980, the plan Caponigro had spent months building required approximately 3 seconds to execute. Angelo Bruno had dinner that night at Caus's Little Italy, a restaurant he had been visiting for years, in a neighborhood where everyone knew who he was, and no one would say so to law enforcement. His driver was John Stanfa, who would survive the events of that evening and would himself become boss of the Philadelphia family in the early 1990s before being convicted on racketeering charges and imprisoned. They returned to Bruno's home at 934 Snyder Avenue around 10 o'clock in the evening. Bruno was in the passenger seat of the car. Stanfa was driving. As they sat in the parked car outside the row house where Bruno had lived for decades, someone approached from behind. A shotgun was fired into the back of Bruno's head at close range. Bruno was killed instantly. Stanfa was wounded by shotgun pellets but survived. The shooter fled immediately. Bruno's body was discovered in the car, and police and emergency response arrived within minutes. News of the death spread quickly through South Philadelphia and through the networks of organized crime families that extended from Philadelphia to New York and beyond. Some accounts report that $300 was found in Bruno's mouth, money stuffed there as a symbolic message about greed or payment, or the profits Bruno had refused to pursue. This detail appears in multiple secondary sources and has become part of how the story is told, but it cannot be definitively verified from primary law enforcement documents or contemporaneous news reports. The detail may be accurate but unreported initially for investigative reasons, or it may be folklore that emerged later and attached itself to the story because it captured something true about the motivations behind the killing, even if the specific fact was not literally present. What is certain is that Angelo Bruno was dead, that Antonio Caponigro had organized his murder, and that the commission would learn of it within hours. Bruno was 69 years old. He had been boss for exactly 21 years. The commission learned that one of its members had been killed without authorization before sunrise on March 22nd, and the men who had killed him had approximately 4 weeks left to live. The speed of what happened next demonstrated that the commission's authority had not weakened in the way Caponigro had apparently calculated. The commission learned of Bruno's death immediately through the same networks that connected all the families. No authorization had been given for the hit. No discussion had occurred about removing Bruno from his position. No complaints had been filed about his leadership that would have justified commission consideration of his removal. The commission's position was immediate and absolute. This was an unacceptable violation of the fundamental rule that held the entire structure together, and everyone involved would be killed. The hunt for Caponigro and his co-conspirators began within hours. Caponigro reportedly believed he could explain his actions, justify them based on Bruno's conservative approach, and missed opportunities, or seek approval retroactively by presenting the hit as a fait accompli that the commission would accept, rather than disrupt the Philadelphia family further by punishing him. He was wrong on every count. Within approximately 3 to 4 weeks, Caponigro was located. He was lured to New York under some pretext, the exact details of which vary between sources. What is documented is that he was tortured before being killed, that the torture was severe and prolonged, and that he was shot multiple times. According to multiple sources, money was stuffed in his mouth and in his anus, a symbolic punishment that made the message explicit. His greed had motivated his unauthorized action, and he would die with the symbol of that greed forced into his body. His body was found in the trunk of a car in the South Bronx in April of 1980, approximately 3 to 4 weeks after Bruno's death. John Simone, Caponigro's brother-in-law and co-conspirator, was killed shortly after Caponigro. His body was found in Staten Island, New York. Frank Sindoni, the other co-conspirator, was killed in October of 1980, several months after the others. His body was found in South Philadelphia. Every single person who had participated in Bruno's murder was eliminated within 7 months. The completeness of the purge was the message. The commission's authority was absolute. You could not kill a boss without permission. The punishment for trying was torture and death, carried out swiftly and publicly enough that everyone in every family understood what had happened and why. Caponigro was approximately 67 years old when he died. He had been in organized crime for decades. His experience and his position as consigliere had not protected him from the consequences of his miscalculation. 7 months after Bruno's death, every man who had participated in killing him was dead, and the position of boss that Caponigro had apparently believed he could claim had passed to someone else entirely. Philip Testa had been Bruno's underboss, and when the boss position opened, the commission approved his succession immediately. Testa was known as Chicken Man, and he had controlled South Philadelphia operations under Bruno, running the gambling and loan sharking and labor rackets that generated the family's income in the neighborhoods where Bruno had built his base. He was approximately 60 years old in 1980. The commission's approval of his succession demonstrated that proper procedure was being maintained. Boss selection required commission authorization, and the Philadelphia family would continue under leadership that respected the institutional rules Caponigro had violated. Testa inherited an organization whose stability had been shattered. Bruno's caution had kept the peace for 21 years, maintaining relationships with other families, avoiding violence that would draw law enforcement attention, and running operations that generated steady profits, without the kind of dramatic expansion that brought federal prosecutors. That peace ended with Bruno's death. Testa faced multiple challenges, maintaining control over family members who had varying opinions about Atlantic City opportunities and drug trafficking, managing ambitious subordinates who might see the recent chaos as an opportunity to advance their own positions, and dealing with the reality that the family's reputation for stability was gone, and other families might see Philadelphia as weak or vulnerable. His reign lasted exactly 1 year. On March 15th, 1981, Philip Testa was killed by a nail bomb that had been planted under the porch of his home on Portico Street in South Philadelphia. The bomb was remotely detonated when Testa returned home in the evening. The bomb contained roofing nails designed to maximize the damage and ensure that the explosion would kill rather than merely injure. Testa was killed instantly. The nail bomb was an unusual weapon for a mob hit, where most killings involved guns fired at close range in the kind of personal confrontation that sent a message about who had the power and the will to use it. The bomb was public, dramatic, and terrorizing, a method that announced not just Testa's death, but a shift in how violence was being deployed. Who ordered Testa's death is disputed between sources. Some accounts blame the emerging faction around Nicodemo Scarfo, who would become the next boss. Others suggest involvement from external families or from subordinates within the Philadelphia organization who saw Testa as an obstacle. What is certain is that the organization was fracturing. Bruno had maintained discipline through respect earned over decades and through a conservative approach that avoided the kind of internal conflicts that ambitious expansion would have created. That discipline was gone. The violence that Bruno had prevented for 2 decades was now consuming the family from within. Testa's reign began in March of 1980 and ended in March of 1981, exactly 1 year minus 6 days. The man who would take control after Testa's death had been waiting in Atlantic City, where Bruno had sent him in exile 17 years earlier, and he had been watching everything that happened with the patience of someone who knew his time would come. Nicodemo Scarfo had been sent to Atlantic City in 1963 after a manslaughter conviction, effectively exiled from Philadelphia by Bruno, and the exile that was meant to diminish him had instead positioned him perfectly for what came next. Scarfo's full name was Nicodemo Scarfo, his nickname was Nicky, and he was born in 1929, which made him 52 years old when he became boss in 1981. His early career had been as a soldier in Bruno's family, working the same South Philadelphia streets where Bruno had built his base, but the 1963 conviction had given Bruno the opportunity to remove him from the center of family operations and send him to Atlantic City, which in 1963 was a declining resort town well past its prime as a destination. Atlantic City in the early 1960s was a place where minor gambling operations and small-time rackets could be run without much interference, but it was not the kind of territory that offered paths to power within the family. Scarfo ran small operations there, away from the main family action in Philadelphia, and the exile was understood by everyone as a way to sideline him and keep him from accumulating the kind of influence that might make him a threat to the established hierarchy. Then, in 1978, New Jersey legalized casino gambling, and Resorts International opened as the first legal casino on the Atlantic City boardwalk in May of that year. Within a few years, multiple casinos were operating, and Atlantic City was generating hundreds of millions of dollars annually in gambling revenue, hotel income, restaurant business, and the construction contracts required to build the massive casino complexes that rose along the waterfront. Scarfo, who had been exiled to Atlantic City 15 years earlier, was now positioned at the center of this new economy. He controlled local operations, had relationships with the unions and contractors who built the casinos and staffed them, and understood the opportunities in ways that someone arriving fresh from Philadelphia would not. The exile Bruno had intended as punishment had become a strategic position. Scarfo built a power base in Atlantic City, while Bruno remained cautious about aggressive involvement in casino operations, unwilling to pursue the expansion that Caponigro and others believed the situation demanded. By 1981, with Bruno and Testa both dead and the Philadelphia family in chaos, Scarfo had the positioning, the ambition, and the commission's approval to become boss. His approach was the opposite of Bruno's in every way that mattered. Bruno had avoided violence when possible. Scarfo embraced it as a tool of control and intimidation. Bruno had kept a low profile, living modestly and avoiding attention. Scarfo would become visible and feared, ruling through displays of power that made everyone around him understand that disloyalty, or even suspected disloyalty, would be met with death. Bruno had prioritized stability and long-term survival. Scarfo prioritized expansion, dominance, and the immediate extraction of profit from every available opportunity. The family that Bruno had kept peaceful for 21 years was about to enter its bloodiest period. What followed was a decade that would prove, beyond any doubt, that Bruno's caution had not been weakness but wisdom, and that the opportunities Caponigro had killed him to pursue would destroy everyone who reached for them. Between 1981 and 1991, the Philadelphia family that had operated in relative peace for 2 decades under Bruno recorded approximately 30 mob-related murders, and the violence brought exactly what Bruno had predicted: cooperating witnesses, federal indictments, and convictions that dismantled the organization. Scarfo became boss in 1981 and ruled as a free man until his conviction in 1988. His approach was to rule through fear and intimidation, making examples of anyone he suspected of disloyalty or disrespect, and the result was a level of internal violence that the family had never experienced under Bruno's leadership. The violence was public and frequent enough that it could not be ignored by law enforcement. FBI agents, state police, and Philadelphia police all focused intensified attention on the family. Surveillance increased, wiretaps were planted and expanded, and the pressure mounted in ways that made it increasingly difficult for the organization to operate without detection. The violence also created exactly the kind of witnesses that Bruno's conservative approach had prevented: men facing murder charges who chose cooperation over loyalty because they understood that the organization under Scarfo was no longer one that protected its members, but one that consumed them. The most significant cooperating witness was Philip Leonetti, who was Scarfo's own nephew and who had served as underboss, the second highest position in the family hierarchy. Leonetti turned a government witness and provided testimony about dozens of murders, about the internal workings of the family, about who ordered what and why, and about the operational details that prosecutors needed to build RICO cases that would survive appeals. RICO prosecutions in the late 1980s targeted Scarfo and multiple other family members. Scarfo was convicted in 1988 on multiple counts, including murder and racketeering. He was sentenced to 55 years in federal prison. Multiple other family members were convicted in related cases, and the family's earning capacity collapsed as key operators were imprisoned, and the networks that generated income were disrupted by law enforcement pressure and internal chaos. The stability Bruno had maintained was gone. The Atlantic City opportunities that had seemed so lucrative brought the kind of law enforcement heat that Bruno had predicted, with federal investigators focusing on casino skimming, union corruption, and the political relationships that allowed the family to operate. The drug trafficking that had seemed profitable created violent competition with other organizations and brought DEA attention that resulted in additional indictments. Everything Caponigro had wanted to pursue, everything that seemed like opportunities too large to ignore, had destroyed the organization within a decade. Scarfo died in prison on January 13th, 2017. He was 87 years old and had spent nearly 30 years imprisoned. The Philadelphia family never recovered the power and stability it had maintained under Bruno. The Philadelphia family that Angelo Bruno had led for 21 years without imprisonment or assassination had, within 11 years of his death, been prosecuted into irrelevance by men who had once been its members and who testified about everything they had seen. The comparison between what Bruno built and what came after him can be measured in years and bodies and convictions, and every measurement tells the same story. Bruno's reign lasted 21 years, from 1959 to 1980. His outcome as boss: killed but never imprisoned, never indicted on racketeering charges, never forced to stand trial in a federal courtroom, facing testimony from cooperating witnesses who had once been his subordinates. The number of murders during the Bruno era is not precisely documented, but every account describes it as remarkably low, with violence used sparingly and only when institutional necessity demanded it. Family stability under Bruno was high, with minimal internal conflict and no succession wars or purges that would have indicated organizational chaos. Law enforcement attention during Bruno's reign was managed effectively enough that he operated for 2 decades without the kind of prosecutorial pressure that would eventually destroy his successors. The leadership after Bruno tells a different statistical story. Philip Testa's reign lasted 1 year, from March of 1980 to March of 1981, ending with his assassination by nail bomb. Nicodemo Scarfo's reign as boss lasted from 1981 to 1988, 7 years before his conviction on murder and racketeering charges brought a sentence of 55 years in federal prison. Subsequent bosses after Scarfo had similarly short tenures, with none achieving anything close to the stability or longevity Bruno had maintained. The estimated number of mob-related murders in Philadelphia from Bruno's death through the early 1990s is approximately 30 or more, a level of violence that stands in stark contrast to the minimal bloodshed of the Bruno era. Cooperating witnesses from the Bruno era were essentially non existent. Bruno's organization was built on loyalty maintained through respect and conservative operation that did not put members in positions where cooperation with law enforcement seemed like the only path to survival. Cooperating witnesses from the Scarfo era were multiple and devastating, including underboss Philip Leonetti, whose testimony about internal family operations provided prosecutors with the detailed knowledge they needed to dismantle the organization. Family power and earning capacity under Bruno were substantial and sustained over 2 decades, generating millions annually through gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and the network of legitimate businesses that laundered criminal proceeds. Family power after Scarfo collapsed and never recovered, with the organization reduced to a fraction of its former influence and income. The opportunities that Caponigro had killed Bruno to pursue, the Atlantic City casino expansion, and the drug trafficking that seemed too profitable to ignore, had brought exactly the law enforcement attention Bruno had predicted. The aggressive expansion brought federal investigators, wiretaps, surveillance, and the kind of prosecutorial resources that RICO statutes made available when organized crime families became targets. Bruno's refusal to pursue these opportunities had seemed to ambitious subordinates like leaving money on the table, like excessive caution that was costing the family profits that other families were claiming. In retrospect, Bruno's conservative approach represented strategic wisdom that preserved the organization for 2 decades by avoiding the exact risks that destroyed it within 1 decade of his death. The violence Bruno had avoided, the public displays of power, and the frequent killings that Scarfo would use to maintain control had seemed weak to subordinates who believed that fear was the most effective tool of leadership. In retrospect, Bruno's minimal violence represented discipline that prevented the cooperating witnesses and the internal chaos that gave prosecutors the evidence they needed to bring convictions. Federal prosecutions during Bruno's 21-year reign, he avoided them entirely. Federal prosecutions in the decade after Bruno's death, they decimated the family and imprisoned its leadership. Caponigro had killed Bruno because he believed the old man's caution was costing the family money, and the result was that within 11 years, there was no family left to make money for anyone. The $300 that may or may not have been found in Angelo Bruno's mouth has become part of how the story is told, and whether the detail is factual or apocryphal, the symbolism it carries is clear enough. The $300 detail is reported in multiple secondary sources, appearing in books about organized crime history and in documentaries about the Philadelphia mob, but it is not consistently confirmed in contemporaneous news reports from March of 1980 or in primary law enforcement documents that are available to researchers. The detail appears more frequently in mob literature and oral histories than it does in the immediate police reports and news coverage that followed Bruno's assassination. This pattern suggests the detail may be folklore that emerged after the fact, a symbolic element that captured something true about the killing's motivations, even if the literal fact was not present at the scene. It is also possible that the detail is accurate but was not reported initially for investigative reasons, with law enforcement choosing not to disclose specific crime scene details that might compromise their investigation or that might be useful in interrogations of suspects. What cannot be definitively verified from available sources is whether the $300 was actually present. If it was present, the symbolism is explicit: greed, payment, blood money, a message that Bruno had been killed for refusing to pursue profits and that his death was the price of that refusal. $300 is a specific amount, neither a round number like 100 or 500, nor a large sum that would represent actual payment for a murder contract. The specificity suggests symbolic rather than practical significance, a sum small enough to be insulting, but large enough to be noticed and remembered. The contrast with Antonio Caponigro's death is worth noting. Multiple sources describe Caponigro's torture and death as involving money stuffed in his mouth and in his anus, symbolic punishment that made explicit the commission's judgment. His greed had motivated his unauthorized killing of a boss, and he would die with the symbol of that greed forced into his body. If both details are accurate, if both Bruno and Caponigro died with money in their mouths, the symbolism creates a bookend effect across the two deaths. Bruno killed for not pursuing money aggressively enough, Caponigro killed for pursuing it too aggressively, and both deaths, marked by the same symbol deployed for opposite reasons. The uncertainty about the detail does not diminish the story's central truth. Whether money was physically present in Bruno's mouth or not, the motivation for his killing was financial. Caponigro and others wanted to pursue opportunities that Bruno refused. The Atlantic City casino expansion, the drug trafficking profits, the aggressive extraction of money from every available source, these were the opportunities that seemed too large to ignore and that Bruno's conservative approach left unexploited. The $300, whether real or symbolic, or detail that emerged in the story's retelling, represents that conflict perfectly. Mob culture has a long history of symbolic violence, of messages sent through the method of killing, the location where bodies are displayed, and the objects left with or on corpses to communicate why someone died and what their death was meant to teach. Money in the mouth would fit this pattern, a message that required no explanation to anyone familiar with the culture and the conflicts that had led to Bruno's death. But verification matters in historical record. What we know for certain is that Angelo Bruno was killed on March 21st, 1980, that Antonio Caponigro organized the assassination, and that financial opportunity motivated the decision. What remains uncertain is the specific detail of $300 in his mouth. The story has absorbed the detail regardless of its verification, which is how mob folklore develops. Symbolic details that capture the truth of an event attach themselves to the narrative and become part of how the story is remembered and told, even when primary documentation cannot confirm them. The $300 functions as both possible fact and certain symbol. Whether the $300 was found in Bruno's mouth, or was a detail that attached itself to the story later, the larger truth it represents is documented beyond dispute. A man was killed for refusing to pursue money, and the men who killed him were themselves killed for pursuing it, and the organization that both groups claimed to serve was destroyed by the choice to value profit over discipline. Angelo Bruno's funeral was held at St. Anthony of Padua Church in South Philadelphia, and hundreds attended, which said something about the man who had lived his entire adult life among them without ever leaving the neighborhood. The funeral drew a mix of legitimate community members who had known Bruno as a neighbor and businessman, and organized crime figures who had worked with him or under him for decades. Bruno had emigrated from Sicily as a child and had lived in South Philadelphia his entire life in America, never moving to a wealthy suburb or a mansion in the countryside, never displaying the kind of ostentatious wealth that would have marked him as different from the working-class Italian-American families who populated the neighborhood. The modest row house at 934 Snyder Avenue, where he had lived throughout his 21 years as boss, was the same kind of house his neighbors occupied, and this modesty was partly operational security, partly personal preference, and partly the cultural practice of old-world bosses who understood that visible displays of wealth drew law enforcement attention and created resentment that could destabilize an organization. Bruno's funeral served dual purposes. It was public mourning for a man who had been part of the community for 69 years, and it was an organized crime gathering where power relationships were on display, and where law enforcement could observe who attended, who sat where, who spoke to whom, and what those arrangements revealed about the current state of family hierarchies. Law enforcement photographed attendees as standard practice at mob funerals, documenting faces and relationships that might prove useful in ongoing investigations or in understanding how the organization was structured. The neighborhood's relationship to Bruno was complicated in the way these relationships always were in Italian-American neighborhoods, where organized crime figures lived among legitimate citizens. Everyone knew who he was and what he represented. He also lived among them, attended church, ran legitimate businesses, and existed as part of the community's daily life. Some saw him as a neighborhood protector, someone whose presence and power provided a form of stability and order. Others saw him as a criminal whose activities brought danger and law enforcement attention to their streets. Most understood that both perspectives were true simultaneously, that Bruno was both community member and mob boss, and that these identities were not contradictory, but overlapping aspects of the same person operating in the same social world. His death marked the end of an era for South Philadelphia, the end of a generation of Italian American organized crime figures who had built power through patience and discipline, who had maintained connections to the old country and the old ways, and who had understood that longevity required discretion. The burial location is not widely documented in available sources. The days immediately after the funeral made the power vacuum apparent. Philip Testa was not yet officially confirmed as boss, and uncertainty about succession meant that the organizational hierarchy was temporarily unclear, with commission approval still pending and with various factions within the family calculating their positions in the new structure. The organization Bruno had controlled for 2 decades was suddenly vulnerable, and everyone involved understood that the stability he had maintained was gone, and that what came next would be determined by who could claim the boss position and whether that person could maintain control. The funeral was the last moment of unity before the chaos began. The man who had kept everything together through caution and patience was being buried, and what would come next would prove that no one who remained had learned what he knew. Angelo Bruno ruled the Philadelphia crime family for 21 years by refusing to do what everyone said would make him rich, and he was killed by the man whose job was to counsel him, and everything that happened afterward demonstrated that the dead man had been right, and everyone who thought they could do better had been catastrophically wrong. He had chosen stability over maximum profit, organizational discipline over immediate opportunity, and institutional longevity over short-term individual gain. The specific things he refused were the things that seemed most obviously profitable to the men around him. Aggressive expansion into Atlantic City casino operations when the casinos opened in 1978 and began generating hundreds of millions of dollars annually, and large-scale involvement in drug trafficking when the heroin trade was producing fortunes for families willing to accept the risks. These refusals frustrated Antonio Caponigro and others who watched opportunities pass by and calculated that the old man's excessive caution was leaving money on the table that other families would claim. Caponigro's calculation was that he could kill Bruno, pursue the opportunities Bruno had refused, and convince the commission to accept the fait accompli, because the money was too obvious and the new boss would deliver profits that justified the unauthorized action. What actually happened was that Bruno was killed on March 21st, 1980. Caponigro was tortured and killed by the commission within approximately 4 weeks. Philip Testa became boss and was killed by nail bomb within 1 year, and Nicodemo Scarfo presided over a decade of violence that brought cooperating witnesses, federal indictments, RICO convictions, and organizational collapse. The opportunities Caponigro had wanted to pursue brought exactly what they delivered: enormous short-term profits and catastrophic long-term consequences. The Atlantic City casino operations brought law enforcement attention from federal investigators who focused on skimming, union corruption, and the political relationships that allowed criminal organizations to operate. The drug trafficking brought DEA scrutiny, violent competition with other trafficking organizations, and the kind of murders that created cooperating witnesses willing to testify about everything they had seen. Scarfo was convicted in 1988 and sentenced to 55 years in federal prison. Multiple other family members were convicted in related prosecutions. The family never recovered its power or stability. Bruno's 21 years of conservative operation stand in statistical contrast to the 11 years of chaos that followed his death. Minimal murders under Bruno versus approximately 30 or more after him, 0 cooperating witnesses under Bruno versus multiple devastating witnesses including underboss Philip Leonetti after him, Bruno never imprisoned as boss versus Scarfo, and others convicted and sentenced to decades in federal custody. The Commission's response to Caponigro demonstrated that the rules still mattered in 1980, that killing a boss without authorization would bring swift execution, and that institutional authority could still reassert itself when violations threatened the structure everyone depended on. But the Commission's power to punish Caponigro could not prevent the chaos that Scarfo unleashed, because institutional discipline only works when the people in positions of power value organizational survival above individual gain. Caponigro valued opportunity over discipline and was killed for it. Scarfo valued dominance and immediate profit over long-term stability and was imprisoned for it. The subordinates who participated in the violence and expansion valued their own advancement over the health of the organization and destroyed their own source of income in the process. Bruno's legacy is as the last example of an old-school boss who understood that the most dangerous opportunities are the ones that work, because short-term success encourages continued pursuit until the cumulative risk destroys you. The Atlantic City casinos generated real revenue. The drug trafficking produced real profits. The convictions that followed were more real than the money. The era Bruno represented ended with his death. What replaced it was short-sighted violence and aggressive expansion that federal prosecutors dismantled within a decade using RICO statutes, cooperating witnesses, and the evidence that the family's own internal chaos provided. The $300, whether it was actually found in Bruno's mouth or whether it is a symbolic detail that captured the truth of why he died, represents the central conflict perfectly: money versus discipline, opportunity versus caution, the new approach versus the old. Bruno died because he would not pursue enough profit. The organization died because his successors pursued too much. The Row House at 934 Snyder Avenue still stands in South Philadelphia. The organization Angelo Bruno built by saying no to opportunities that seemed too profitable to refuse is gone. The men who killed him believing they could do better are dead or imprisoned. The family that survived 21 years under his conservative discipline destroyed itself within 11 years without it, which raises a question that Bruno spent 21 years answering and his consigliere spent 4 weeks learning. In an organization built on discipline, what happens when someone mistakes opportunity for wisdom?